Our title for this morning is Does Justice Rule the Universe? Or Does Justice Rule? And of course, we realize that the Bible quotation which we just read you sounds very sad, very dire, and indeed, shall we say, perhaps very threatening. Nevertheless, I hope that we all remember the Kabbalistic interpretations of the Bible, especially those parts of the Bible which were specifically written by Kabbalists, have a meaning very different most of the time from what we would give it if we just judged or analyzed it from the surface. Because always remember, in Kabbalah there are specific aspects involved which deal with the terminology and the relationships in the terminology, where the Hebrew words give a hint as to what part of the tree of life to look at. And so in these Proverbs, the wisdom teachings of Solomon, what we have just read you truly has a very different meaning from what it sounds like. It's pretty much like teaching one thing to the masses and another thing to those who are ready. It's like Jesus teaching the masses in one way, but to his own disciples he gave the secret teachings, the truths, the hidden interpretations. And of course the reasons for this are very clear, because as we hope you will see by the time we're through with this little talk, we hope that you will come to realize that certain truths are not for the masses, mainly because the masses will misinterpret them and use them as an excuse for going the way of what we may call, at least temporarily, the way of evil. But always remember, when we use this word in accordance with the deepest esoteric Western occult teachings, the word evil has not got the same meaning that it has for other people. It is specifically used in the Kabbalistic manner. It is thought of as immaturity. It is known to be merely the relative aspect of immature action, reaction, immature thinking and feeling, and an inevitable part of growth, which makes it quite different from that of the absolute evil and the usual orthodox teachings which exhort you in very solemn and a very threatening manner to be saved and instantly, lest you live eternally in hell. And we know how many jokes have come about in relation to hell, inasmuch as the people who seem to be the most self-righteous, and we mean self-righteous, who seem so sure that heaven is going to be their lot, as we meet these people, we become very suspicious of what heaven might be like, and many of us start preferring the other place in self-defense, and most understandably. So let's at least analyze a few of the ideas that relate to what we have just written in terms of Kabbalah. Remember, whenever understanding is used in Kabbalah, it refers to the cosmic mother, the principle of differentiation, the principle, indeed, of incarnation. And that's that black circle on the tree of life, the cosmic she. And then whenever, that is when understanding is spoken of. And then whenever wisdom is spoken about, it always refers to the cosmic father, to that gray circle. And always wisdom and understanding truly come together, as we see even on the tree. They are forever conjoined, as it says in Kabbalah. They are forever in union. And therefore the one inevitably brings the other. So that when we are told that we must follow the ways of wisdom and understanding, else all sorts of sorrows will be heaped upon our heads, we are definitely being told that we must follow the ways of understanding and wisdom in terms of guidance in, through, and from the highest principles within divinity. And of course, we must always remember that this is something all of us aspire to. None of us have attained to this yet. Some do it a little better than others. The whole process of growth, the whole process of evolution, the entire intention in relation to our work is to help aspirants step by step grow into the ability and the capacity to live from the guidance of that level consciously and fully. Nevertheless, we also know that this cannot be done in a day, in a week, in a month. And we endeavor in every way possible to help show you how to grow your own, shall we say, vehicles, since you must in the final analysis, and how to see where it is that apparent injustice has not been so unjust, but also to change, and we mean entirely change, your ideas relating to justice in every way. You see, unhappily, not only in this culture, but if you just think back historically, you will see that ideas of justice have been synonymous in human consciousness with punishment. And so people go about thinking of punishment in terms of the transgressor. And of course, surely we all realize that inasmuch as everyone has a different idea as to what is good and what is bad, we always have many people thinking and expecting that other people are going to get real comeuppances, and we sort of secretly delight in the idea that they're going to have a pretty hellish time of it, don't we now? Because they do not follow the way which we think is good. You remember that little story we told you that in relation to the last war. I really don't know if it's true or not. It's just such a lovely story, but it shows this point so well, where the head of our forces, having landed in the Philippine island, you remember that one, asked the chief of that little island to help in relation to the Japanese, because the Japanese had also landed on that other side of the island, and so the chief, this little island, remember, was inhabited by cannibals. And remember how the chief was called to the captain, and that together they spoke about the needs, and the chief said he would think about whether they would give him help or not, retired for 3 days, and finally came back and said, "I'm sorry, we have decided that not only will we not give you any help, but we have instructed all our people to have nothing to do with you whatsoever. The reason for this being that we consider you very evil and very immoral. We've watched you carefully for 3 days, and we find that you kill far more than you can possibly eat." You know, this of course is very wasteful. Now, an idea of what is good and what is evil, it depends on your framework. And you see, because we're raised in our culture, we have a set of goods and bads too, which, if we only knew it, on the whole, have the same type of background that our cannibal chiefs. And do you know, I think he was far more moral, really, if you'll consider it, than the ideas that we hold in relation to good or evil. Think how many people have been miserably treated, for example, by those near and dear to them because, say, they like to play a game of cards. You think it still doesn't happen? Go out to some of the little spots in the Middle West. There are plenty of communities right in the heart of the cities. Think of what's thought of some of the people because perhaps they love to dance. They're thought of as evil. And imagine the kind of thinking and feeling that goes pouring outward from those good, and we put the word good in quotes, these good people who know that they travel the way of righteousness. Think what kind of thinking and feeling they pour out to others, and just what kind of retribution they expect these others to have. And unfortunately, we find the same thing right in occultism. Truly we do. You attend any little group, I don't care whether it's theosophists whether it's unity, whether it's new thought, whether it's yoga, whether it's Zen, whether it's Vedanta. You just sit around and listen to the little clicks, and you will discover that everyone who does not exactly follow the mores and ethics as laid down by that group is looked upon with scorn in some way or other. Those who think they're very spiritual will shake their heads sadly and say, oh, the poor things, they don't know what they're doing to themselves. I hate to think of the karma they're making. I hate to think of it. Have we said it, perhaps, my darlings? If we have, let's chuckle at ourselves. That's the best way to overcome some of these elements in our nature. And remember, we have to go to work at home. We're never going to reform the world. And really, we're never even going to reform ourselves. But don't be disheartened. What we want to do is come to the point where we don't want to reform ourselves. What we want to do is come to the point where we just want to grow ourselves into ever wider vistas of insight and understanding and livingness. Because, you know, it is true beyond description. We do not solve our problems. We outgrow them. So there's only one thing to yearn for, growth. There's only one thing to look for, trying to develop wisdom and understanding. All else is a lot of covering up, burying of what could be basic truths in a morass of not only nonsense, but, forgive me, of actual garbage. Truly it is. And indeed, it is because of this that we go around in confusions and in circles. We keep coming back from the same door wherein we went. So we want to give some examples, because after all, the title of this sermon is, Does Justice Rule? Let's give a few examples, and then we will try to give you as accurate a description as we can of what the real esoteric meaning of justice happens to be. And truly, we might just say beforehand, justice rules, of course it does, but we are not in a position, with our limited thinking, limited feeling, limited awarenesses, to see it or know it. If you look through a keyhole into a room, you have only a keyhole vision. Suppose somebody walks across the room. You cannot see the full person. You're only seeing through the small keyhole. You'll see something in motion, and you'll give it an interpretation, you see. And you'll think this is the way it is, and it isn't that way. It isn't that way at all. So all your plans, all your hopes, all your interpretations will be in terms of this keyhole vision. And you can see then why everybody is in trouble most of the time, some all the time, and everybody some of the time. It's because we cannot see the whole picture. Nevertheless, understanding it, acknowledging this, accepting, and it's certainly easy to accept this idea, it's so obvious that we cannot see the whole picture. Therefore, in recognition of this, it will help us at least to stop condemning, to stop feeling so spiritually superior because our little clique or our little group has a way of life, a whole nice little list of what's good and bad. You know, one of the greatest shocks I ever had was when right within our own work, where we emphasize so consistently the need to accept human beings as they are, not to judge and condemn and call this or that good and bad in terms of personalities. The greatest shock we ever had was when we discovered a little group had managed to grow right within our group. This happened a long time ago and is happily dissolved. Who had set themselves up as the judges of the goods and bads in relation to some of the very finest aspirants in our work, because these had not followed their idea of what the word spiritual means. They had been so conditioned that they still had ideas that if maybe once in a while somebody got annoyed and used the word hell, and occasionally liked to smoke a cigarette or take a cocktail before dinner, they had decided that this was evidence of a very unspiritual type, and not only evidence of an unspiritual type, but evidence also of a very coarse vehicle which couldn't possibly be open to the spiritual awarenesses and guidance. You see, these are the traps we fall into, and right in occultism we find the same things all the time. Apparently no one is entirely free of it, and yet we will never understand what justice means, what karma really involves. We never will, as long as we have to set up our rigid rules. Of course, it's true, let us grant it. It's certainly true. In a society where you have so many different, shall we say, ages of the personality soul, we don't mean the physical age of the vehicle. Some people walk around 100 years old or 90 years old, and their emotions never went beyond the age of 2, and their mentalities never beyond the age of 7 or 8. And we know what that can mean. It isn't the physical age, it's the mental, emotional age that we speak of, which make up, after all, the depth and wisdom and understanding of the soul. So it isn't the physical age that is involved here at all. But we must grant and we must acknowledge that with so many immaturities, we do have terrible things that go on. We do. When man believes in monstrosities, or no, when man believes in atrocities, he commits monstrosities. Anyway, it's something like that. And so what we believe becomes the core of our entire life. Now then, let's examine that a little in terms of justice. For example, I'm going to give you a little case history or two. There's the man married to the woman. This woman basically hates men, subconsciously. She hates men because she felt rejected by Papa. You know, our modern psychologists give us an awful lot of malarkey, excuse the slang, on that idea. Nevertheless, it's partially true, because it has to do with inner relationships, karmic more or less, which we brought down from other incarnations. And so our response, or at least the way we interpret our relationships, definitely have to do with that idea. Now this wife, let us say, she might have had a very wonderful and loving father, but her inner emotional response mechanism was such that she would be hunting for areas in the relationship that would show that she was rejected. Doesn't mean she was. This is the thing that we have to always watch in ourselves. We look for what we are and we find it. So this particular woman, this wife, in reality she looked for evidence of rejection, and so of course she found it. And when she got married, she continued to look for the same evidence in her husband. Well, she happened to marry a man. You know, the subconscious is a marvelous thing. Attractions are as perfect as anything could be imagined, although we cannot see it on the surface. Again, it shows why we must not judge from surface appearances. Because someone who has a need to be destructive will inevitably, on the subconscious level, be attracted to somebody who has a need to be destroyed. And the one who has the need to be destroyed subconsciously will inevitably be attracted to the one who can do the destroying. Yet what they say is, I have fallen in love. and they are in seventh heaven, their hearts wash with glory. You will look at them, and indeed, for a short time, they'll even radiate. Actually, it's because they subconsciously they know they're going to be fulfilled. One knows it's going to have a lot of opportunity to destroy, and the other a lot of opportunity to be destroyed, and it's very sad, truly, it is. Great tragedy comes from these things, but we will try to show how even out of that comes the good, or shall we say at least the good in terms of growth. When we say anything is good, we think of it in terms of evolving consciousness. If it serves to grow you, it's good, whatever misery is involved. And apparently all growth has its misery, or does, until we reach a certain stage where we don't need it anymore. Or shall we say, we don't find it necessary to choose our relationships in terms of being miserable. So then, in this particular instance, here we have this wife who has a need to destroy. We have the husband who has a need to be destroyed. They marry, and for a very short time they find very charming things to discover in each other, because remember, relationships aren't all one thing. They're mixed. They're ambivalent. I mean, there are some parts between the natures that would have to be constructive and so on. You can't go all the way over on one end or the other. But then the real business at hand starts to develop. In this case history, the man inevitably did something that shocked his wife, gave her verification in relation to rejection, gave her then the driving, intense hatred where she had to, from then on, punish him in every way she could. And the way she chose was to try to destroy his masculine sexual powers subtly, very subtly. This is a very important case history that we're trying to share with you, because it shows a principle and this principle works whether it be between friends, between relationships professionally, the relationships by blood, and so on. The principle works. It's usually shown in a more startling manner when it's given in this particular way. That's why we use this case history, to show how we make what we want and then weep at the injustice. That's the point, and why it's so important to find out what justice is and is not. So then, in this instance, the woman come in, dear. In this particular case history then, the woman proceeded to reject this husband, who was a very fervent, passionate and loving individual. And for 13 or 14 years this continued. She kept screaming, "You don't really love me." He kept screaming, "You are my life, you are my love, you are my all. Why do you reject me?" She kept saying, "I do not reject you, I am ill." And she got herself beautiful symptoms. And this went on and on and on. The man finally went to a marriage counselor. The marriage counselor gave the thing up in despair. I don't want to tell you what he said, but it was very strong. Modern psychology has a term for it. Anyway, he said, in essence, that the woman really wished to destroy his masculinity, and that he saw no hope, because neither of them saw the other individual realistically. Now then, when the counselor threw the whole thing up and said he couldn't see anything but separation, the man became outraged that such a thought should enter anybody's head, and he was still determined that this marriage was going to be wonderful and perfect, and by then they were married something like 21, 22 years. He was still determined that this had to be a perfect marriage. He was still determined that he had to change and become a perfect man. And incidentally, in this instance, the man happened to be a very thoughtful, loving type of individual. Now then, what was it that finally happened here. This was very interesting, and it isn't that it's finished. The case history is still being watched. This man finally was driven into searching for the answers and entered occultism. Now he came across these beautiful ideas. Here's the crux of the matter. He came across all these beautiful ideas of what is karma. And his favorite, mind you, his favorite little quotation from this pattern on the trestle board is this one. I recognize the manifestation of the undeviating justice in all the circumstances of my life. This became to him like a shot of dope. It became to him the intoxicant that made him feel a sense of joy. But, and this is going to shock you, we hope it's going to shock you anyway, this man used this idea to remain miserable because the real thing has not yet hit him. And we only hope and pray for his sake, and eventually it will, except we wonder if it'll be this incarnation. You see, there's the danger of teaching truths to those who haven't got what it takes to understand it. Because, you see, people take the idea of karma, they take this whole retribution aspect, and then they say, well, I am suffering the retribution. I am getting what I earned, and the thing I've got to do is stay with it and suffer it out in order to be through with it. My beloved ones, this is not occultism. This is sheer rationalization of a destructive aspect of the heart that continues and remains determined to be mistreated, persecuted, destroyed. And it covers itself up with lovingness, with sweetness, with strength, with endurance, and with aspiration. These are the dangers. Just a little case history like this perhaps will show you why so much in occultism has been kept so secret, and why certain ideas, which we give you even here, we sometimes tremble and wonder how many are going to utilize these ideas for their own continued negative or self-destructive purposes. Now, why would an individual want to remain so self-destructive? Let us ask this next question. Well, the why is something that cannot be answered just so glibly. Of course, amateur psychologists always can tell you what's wrong with you psychologically, and they can settle things for you very quickly. And I remember Dr. Case always used to say, God preserve me from these amateur psychologists. And we might also say, God preserve us from the amateur occultists, because you have the same tendencies there. All right, now, what, though, could this self-destructive need be? Well, basically, a human being who is self-destructive, and everybody is to some degree, by the way, but there's a matter of degree and degree. We're trying to outgrow it, of course. But when one is self-destructive, certainly the one thing we can be sure of, we hate ourselves. Don't think otherwise. Otherwise, why would we be determined to remain in a situation, in a vibration, in a group of relationships that is injurious? We hate ourselves basically when we are determined to remain in an unhappy situation. All right, others can say, but there are certain situations you cannot walk out of. Let's say you have a married couple, there are these children. You have to, after all, the family life comes first. Indeed, family life comes first, but one must understand what is the best thing for the family. Do you really think, that where a husband and wife hate each other subconsciously, that the children are being constructively raised? Do you know that even modern psychology has now discovered that the very worst atmosphere that an infant and child can be raised in is the atmosphere of disrespect, dissension, and hatred between the parents in the home? This has been definitely established through scientific, very strict scientific research. Then, did you know that every infant and every child is so tuned in and so responsive to the subconsciousness of the mother, particularly, but also of the father, that its whole nature becomes warped if it grows up in this kind of atmosphere? Therefore, when people say to themselves, I remain for the sake of the children, again, how much understanding and wisdom is there? Children must come first. Our first responsibility is to the helpless. But do you see, we have to know what is truly the best thing for this precious treasure that's put in our care, and what is not. Children who live in an atmosphere of dissension between parents never seem, except if they're very rare souls, never seem to develop the capacity for loving, demonstrating, and giving true affection. You see, they haven't had the impact in their background, in their lives. And remember, we all affect each other all the time. Everything you think and feel influences me and everyone else, and everything I think and feel influences you. And the most intensive influence is right there in a home center. So ignorance is a dangerous thing, a very dangerous thing. And the rationalizations that we make in order to remain unhappy is staggering. There isn't a single human being, truly, in a sense, who has a right to be unhappy. And those of us who are unhappy because we are still ignorant of the true laws of the universe. Now, justice, then, what has that got to do with it? Because the reason we speak of it in these terms, the ideas of justice with most human beings are more or less synonymous with pain. And therefore, if we suffer, we figure we're getting our comeuppances, and incidentally, so we are, of course. This is not untrue. Of course we're getting our comeuppances. But a continued self-hatred, a continued disrespect of ourselves, or a continued feeling of insecurity, a feeling unlovable, and so on, this just keeps us projecting and growing the next experience, which will again be unhappy. Therefore, what do we do? The point is, human consciousness, don't forget, is made in the image and likeness of God. It's a miniature, it's a replica of these divine powers because it's an aspect of the divine. Therefore, human consciousness is destined, absolutely destined, to discover how these laws of cause and effect work, and therefore how to consciously deal with them so as to have happiness and fulfillment. Now, we hope no one here says, well, isn't the happiness and fulfillment idea a selfish thing? Aren't those who are truly spiritually oriented supposed to give up the ideas of personal happiness and fulfillment in order to give to life and to help others be fulfilled? My darlings, no human being can give others happiness and fulfillment if they haven't got it themselves. And too long have those who have nothing but bitterness in their hearts and disrespect and hatred for themselves gotten up there and tried to preach their nonsense to others, and too long do the blind continue to lead the blind. If a person hasn't got joy, he cannot distribute it to life. If a person hasn't got wisdom, he cannot distribute it to life. If a person hasn't got happiness and love, he cannot distribute it to life. You can give only what you are and what you've got. Therefore, it's vital that we develop our lovingness, our responsiveness to life in a proper manner. So if something occurs that is productive of unhappiness, and of course it will occur, we are growing, we are immature, we have held and we hold all kinds of foolish things in our minds and hearts. How do we deal with it in order to get out of the trap where we keep doing the same thing, weaving, creating the same thing over and over again? The thing we have to do is go to work on our response to the condition. That is the only place where it can be dealt with and handled and changed. And we have to change it sooner or later. Unfortunately, most of us seem to need to be ground down so that we're practically a pulp before we're desperate enough to go to work and transmute that area in our nature which brings us sorrow and unhappiness. But some of us become wise enough so the moment an unhappy condition appears, we go to work on it instantly and we save ourselves the need for further despair. But when that happens, I suspect it's because we've already had our full measure of the despair. Apparently, that's what it takes life to drive the solid or apparently solid patterns that hang on with such persistence. So we must look to our responses. If something occurs in our lives where we see that we are being rejected, we must instantly look to our reaction. Instead of every time the unhappiness comes, every time the morbidness comes, what we must do is instantly take this emotion, give it to the higher self, and work at being grateful and happy and loving from loving within outwards. Work at accepting ourselves. In other words, catch the reaction emotionally inside, and the faster we can do this, the more then we change the karma, and the more readily does the next situation come about which is productive of more fulfillment, or a greater fulfillment than we were capable of before. But if we do not change that emotional response from within ourselves, we're going to have the same experience next time and next time and next time and next time, even though it may not appear like it on the surface. We'll think, oh, this is something new, this is something different. But you see, what we feel, we project, and we force other people to act towards us in terms of what we're projecting to them. We force them to. We're the tyrants, even though they may be tyrannizing us. That's why it's so vital to change these ideas. Now then, the question of justice has often been brought up in terms of terrible things which we are well aware of going on in the world. For instance, in the Hitler days, the terrible crimes which were committed. People who are deeply philosophical, will say, do you think that a thing like that could be just? Well, you know, that's a rough question to answer. And indeed, one of the reasons that it makes it even tougher than it would be ordinarily happens to be because a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And to give the true esoteric teaching on this type of thing could, with a goodly percentage of human beings, make them go off on a very unconstructive tangent in their own growth with their own misinterpretations. So that often we are reluctant to give the true esoteric teaching on some of these profound questions, and yet in our work we feel we must. We feel that because in this age there's been such an influx of souls who are ready to go the real path of return, because of this we feel we have to give it and risk the misunderstandings and misinterpretations, knowing that in time even those who misunderstand will awaken. Though unfortunately it's usually a rough way to have to do it. When a true principle is taken and misinterpreted in terms of livingness. All right, now this idea then of the tortures that human beings have been subjected to, babies, children, so on. How do we correlate that with the justice rule and with a loving God? This is a serious question. I was an atheist for several years because of this one point. So, and I can sympathize with every human being who feels atheistic over a question like that, believe me. However, there is an answer if you can receive it. But your mind will not be able to fully comprehend it. You have to receive it with your heart. That's, of course, a hard thing, especially for men to do, because the man must analyze and weigh and measure, and it is necessary that this be so. Nevertheless, there are some things that the heart must be able to receive, and let the mind give it time to analyze and weigh it as it watches it in operation. If this can be done, the truth will be seen in time. Then the answer to that question is basically this. First of all, there is no such thing as any separate individual suffering. There's one life only, and that one life is the universal self. It is God. This doesn't mean we're not individuals. You see, don't mistake that. All right, but every single aspect of life, and this does not mean just people, it includes animals and plants and stars, stones and trees and birds, everything, is an aspect of God. It's a rather pantheistic idea, but this goes beyond pantheism, truly. Now then, everything being an aspect of the one self, this one self is, shall we say, individualizing, could we say, parts of its own, the cells of its own mind, growing itself from its own substance, from its own mind, individualized self-conscious centers of self-knowingness. I hope we haven't made it too abstract, because this is a really true principle that exists universally. Now then, this process of self-individualization, that is, individualizing aspects of itself, comes about more or less like a dancer, say, deciding, or someone deciding, I'm going to be a dancer. You know, a really fine dancer has to go through the most grueling self-disciplines, has to put himself or herself through pain, muscle pain, emotional pain, pounding, jumping, kicking, stretching, moaning, groaning. I don't know how many of you have watched the painful process which ballet dancers go through to become ballet dancers. Yet each one of those dancers wants that pain, wants that discipline, because of the joy of being a dancer, because of wanting to experience the miracle of the motion of the dance. In the same manner, and analogous to that idea, every single human being, and certainly really everything that lives, is an aspect of this one life, this one God, this one livingness. And the process of developing the ability to be self-conscious and within this self-consciousness to utilize powers consciously. This process is the self-discipline. It is the pain that every center of life goes through. But who is experiencing the pain? There's only one individual. Now, if I could inflict pain upon you, in that idea of, say, free will, where you've done nothing to deserve it, as the world would say, this would sound very bad. But if I, because I want to, inflict upon myself the muscular disciplines in order to become an athlete or a dancer or a singer, do you know what a singer has to go through? Or a musician, my heavens, the way they pound and pound and pound on a piano to become virtuosos. no matter what it is that one wants to become. But if I decide that I want this kind of discipline, which is pain, then there isn't anything evil involved in the pain in the final analysis, is there? Well, the true esoteric teaching is that pain comes as a result of the self, and we might as well each call it our higher self, because we each have a higher self that is the direct aspect of God. Pain, then, is because we ourselves, that in us which says I, when we say I love, when we say I hate, when we say I eat, I walk, whatever it is, that true I, that is the thing that experiences the pain, and that is what is bringing the self-disciplines which we interpret or call pain. So this is point number one about the pain aspect. All right, now then, point number two. What is the purpose of this if, say, I consciously do not know that I have chosen it? It seems kind of foolish, say many people. It doesn't seem to hold water in many ways. Well, there are many things we do not know consciously for a time that we know later. For instance, under hypnosis, there are all sorts of things we have experienced, which we've forgotten, but under hypnosis we remember. And according to the esoteric teachings, the whole idea of pain is really to develop the capacity for self-conscious, ecstatic, joyous knowledge of the unity of life and the ability to handle and direct the powers of life. To handle the powers of life. We cannot handle the powers of life unless we practice handling them. Therefore, if I am self-destructive and I therefore choose a partner who's going to be hurting me, in essence, what I am doing is handling the powers of life. In other words, with my own consciousness, I am building an unhappy condition which will press me down and press me down over and over again until finally it will force my mind into other larger areas of research and insight and understanding and bring about what? Expansion. And what else? Ability to control and cope and change this situation. And this is the way consciousness apparently grows. So that, in a sense, we can say to you at this point, the question, does justice rule, is an incorrect one. In a sense, we can say to you, there is no such thing as justice or injustice. It's another one of the illusions. But inasmuch as we do have to deal with these ideas in the relative universe, we have to deal with them in the terms as we mentioned when we read you that part from the pattern on the trestle board. But those who experience the full essence of who and what they are, the one thing they come to know without any question is that their own volition is that which makes and breaks every situation and condition, and that what is called justice merely happens to be the glorious law of cause and effect of action which presses human consciousness ever forward into expansion and self-awakening and the utilization of powers. And so the less we become concerned about justice as in the usual ways, and more concerned with giving out love and help to those who require it, and releasing our own need for whatever it is we think of in terms of justice, the more we will be opening the gates to the true insight into universal principles and the ability to handle them, to be co-creators with God, of God, for God. And thus will we be building happiness. In other words, we'll start becoming willing to be happy. That is the peculiar thing. And the more willing we are to be happy, the more willing are we going to be to let the universal laws work out the growth process and just give from whatever area that we're in. Well, we hope that you have at least another concept of what justice might imply. There's too much to the subject or the topic to cover it in one talk. We usually bring in different aspects of it practically every time we speak in the Thursday night class or the sermons and so on. Nevertheless, little bits here and there, one day it'll all suddenly fall in place, and we'll know that we don't have to ever worry about justice. We'll know that all pain is actually the privilege that is all of our own personal pains, have been the privilege of consciousness and growth within our own being, and yet because of this knowledge we'll have that much more compassion for others and try to help lift this load of pain from the world, from life, from beingness itself, because this too is our destiny. Pain is only all right if it is working to serve a purpose, and then you're able to let it go. Remember what we told you about the case that was hanging on to it and calling it by beautiful names. Start throwing away your pain if you can, and you'll emanate more beauty to those around you, and this perhaps is our first responsibility to all of life and God.